In this video, we will explore the 100-year war that took place between England and France. We will start at the beginning of the war and follow it through to the end. If you enjoy these videos, please feel free to leave a like and/or subscribe. But for now, sit back, relax, and enjoy. Now close your eyes, breathe slowly, and let the world around you soften. We are going a long way back now, more than 600 years, across a sea that is gray and cold and restless. We are going to a time when Europe was a patchwork of kingdoms and duchies, of feudal oaths and ancient bloodlines, of cathedrals rising stone by stone from muddy fields. A time when most people never traveled more than a day's walk from the village where they were born. Find a comfortable stillness. Let your body grow heavy. This is the early 14th century. The year is somewhere around 1300, and the world is old in ways we can barely imagine, and young in ways we have long since forgotten. France, in this time, is the greatest kingdom in all of Christendom. Imagine it laid out below you as if seen from a great height, a country of rolling green hills and slow rivers, a forest so dense and ancient that whole armies could vanish inside them. The Loire winds westward through meadows where cattle stand knee-deep in morning mist. The Seine curves through the heart of Paris, where the towers of Notre Dame have only just been completed, their pale stones still new enough to gleam. To the south, the Dordogne flows through valleys cut deep into limestone, past villages clinging to cliff sides like barnacles on rock. France is wealthy. France is powerful. The French king holds sway over vast territories, commands the loyalty of powerful nobles, and is regarded by much of Europe as the most cultured, most civilized monarch in the world. And yet underneath all of this, there are cracks. There are always cracks. To the northwest of France lies a region called Normandy, and to the southwest lies another called Gascony. Both of these lands under the rule of the English crown. This is not an accident of geography. It is a long shadow of history. 2.5 centuries before our story begins, a Norman duke called William had crossed the English Channel with an army and defeated the English king in a battle near the town of Hastings. William became king of England, and through him, and through his descendants, and through generations of marriages and inheritances and feudal arrangements too complicated to follow in the light of day, let alone in the soft dark of the night, the kings of England had come to hold land in France as vassals to the French crown. Vassals. That word is important. It means that when an English king held land in France, he was, in theory, a subject of the French king. He owed homage. He was supposed to kneel. You can perhaps already sense the trouble that would come from this. Let your breath settle. There is no hurry. By the early 1300s, the French king ruling from Paris is Philip IV, known to history as Philip the Fair, a name given not to his character but to his appearance. He is tall, cold, handsome, and utterly ruthless. He taxes the church. He arrests the Pope. He destroys the Knights Templar, that ancient order of warrior monks seizing their wealth and burning their Grand Master at the stake. Philip is not a man who tolerates competing power. His relationship with the English king, Edward I, is one of wary tension. Edward controls Gascony, that fertile, wine-rich region in southern France, and Philip is not comfortable with this. There are disputes over borders, over trade, over the proper forms of feudal submission. There are small wars, truces, and negotiations conducted across the Channel. None of it resolves anything. Not really. These two kings are like stones placed too close together. Pressure builds between them without ever fully releasing. Then, in the span of just a few years, something happens that will change everything. Philip the Fair dies in 1314. He leaves behind 3 sons, and 3 sons means 3 kings in quick succession: Louis X, Philip V, John I, names that blur into one another like faces seen through rain. One by one, these sons come to the throne. One by one, they die young, and one by one, they leave behind no male heirs. In medieval France, this is a catastrophe. The question of who may inherit a kingdom was not merely political. It was theological, philosophical, and military. Entire bodies of law existed to answer it. And when the last of Philip's sons died in 1328, the French nobles turned to a legal principle called the Salic law of ruling that said, in essence, that the French crown could not pass through a woman. This mattered because there was a strong claimant, who had a claim through his mother. His name was Edward. He was the King of England. Breathe slowly. We are in no hurry. Edward III of England was 17 years old in 1328. His mother was Isabella of France, the daughter of Philip the Fair. Through her, Edward could trace a direct line to the French royal house, a line arguably more direct than that of the man the French nobles chose instead, Philip of Valois, a cousin of the dead king, who became Philip VI. The French said, the claim cannot pass through a woman. The English said, the claim passed through a woman. Yes, but it arrived in the hands of a man. The French said, you are not French. You are not one of us. The English said, you are afraid. For now, the argument was settled by swords and silence. Philip VI took the throne. Edward, young and not yet powerful enough to challenge him, accepted the situation grudgingly, and with reservations he did not bother to hide. He did homage for Gascony. He bent his knee, but he did not forget. Let the darkness hold you. Imagine England in these years. It is a smaller country than France, less populous, with wilder coastlines and rougher weather. The court of Edward III is at Westminster, along the banks of the Thames, and the young king is ambitious in a way that quiet men seldom are and reckless men seldom sustain. He is neither quiet nor reckless. He is watchful. He is patient. He builds. He trains. He cultivates the loyalty of his nobles. He fights wars in Scotland to sharpen his army's wars, brutal and grinding, fought in mud and cold, against an enemy who knows the terrain better than he does. He learns from these wars. He learns what works. He learns what men can bear. He also broods. In France, on the throne he believes was stolen from him, on the slight of having bent his knee. The years pass. Children are born. Alliances are made. Wine flows in both kingdoms, and the harvests come and go. People plant grain and cut wood and bury their dead without knowing what is coming. But it is coming. To understand why England and France went to war, you must understand wool. This may seem a strange place to begin, not with armies or thrones, but with the backs of sheep on English hillsides. But wool was the engine of the medieval economy, and the English produced the finest wool in the known world. Long staple, soft, abundant, grown on the backs of millions of sheep grazing the downs of Yorkshire and the Cotswolds and the Welsh marches. This wool went somewhere. It went, most of it, to Flanders. Flanders, the region we might now call Belgium and northern France, was a great weaving heart of northern Europe. Its cities were extraordinary for their time. Ghent, Bruges, Ypres dense, prosperous, loud with the clatter of looms, rich with the smell of dye and damp cloth. Flemish weavers turned English wool into cloth that was sold across the whole of Christendom, from the markets of Paris to the trading floors of Venice. It was a relationship of mutual dependence. England needed Flanders to buy its wool. Flanders needed England to supply its looms. And Flanders was, technically, a vassal of France. Let your body sink a little deeper into warmth. You can perhaps see where this is going. Philip VI of France, the man who had taken the throne Edward believed, began to press his authority over Flanders. The Count of Flanders was his subject. He said, the Flemish towns would obey. The Flemish towns did not particularly want to obey. They were wealthy and independent-minded, and their wealth came not from France but from England. When Philip attempted to assert control, the Flemish merchants looked nervously across the channel. Edward watched all of this with the careful attention of a man who has been waiting for an opportunity. He found an ally in a man named Jacob van Artevelde, a wealthy merchant of Ghent, charismatic and bold, who led a popular revolt against the pro-French Count of Flanders and declared that the Flemish towns would align themselves with England. This was a commercial decision dressed in political clothing. It was also an act of considerable courage, because Philip VI did not forgive defiance. For Edward, it was exactly the foothold he needed. But there was a problem. The Flemish towns were, even in rebellion, technically still subject to France. For them to ally openly with England to welcome English merchants, to sell English wool, to shelter English soldiers, they needed a justification, a legal and moral argument that made their allegiance respectable. And here Edward made a decision that transformed a commercial dispute into something far larger. In 1337, he renewed his claim to the French throne. He declared, formally and publicly, that he was a rightful king of France. He quartered the French fleur-de-lis onto his royal coat of arms. He sent heralds across the Channel with letters explaining his position, and he gave the Flemish towns an argument. They were not betraying their king by siding with Edward, because Edward was a true king. Philip VI responded by declaring Gascony forfeit, confiscating those English lands in southern France that had been the source of tension for so long. It was an act of dispossession, an assertion of absolute authority. Edward called it a declaration of war. He was right. Breathe slowly. The night is still and quiet around you. In October of 1337, Philip VI formally announced what he called an overt and open war against England. This date is often given as the beginning of what we now call the 100 Years' War, though the men living through it had no way of knowing it would last so long. They thought, as men always do, that it would be settled quickly, a season, perhaps a campaign or two. It would last, in its various phases, for 116 years. The first years were more preparation than battle. Edward had a war to fund, and funding medieval warfare was brutally difficult. He borrowed enormous sums from Italian banking houses the Bardi and Peruzzi of Florence, dynasties of moneylenders so vast that their eventual bankruptcy, partly caused by Edward's debts, would help destabilize the European economy for a generation. He taxed his wool merchants. He negotiated and cajoled and promised things he was not entirely sure he could deliver. He also began to gather an army. Imagine the English countryside in these years, the villages and market towns, the smiths hammering at their forges, the Fletchers straightening arrow shafts by firelight. The war is an abstraction to most people, a rumor carried by travelers. But its demands are real. Men are being levied. Equipment is being requisitioned. The roads are busy with carts carrying supplies toward the ports. The archers are worth pausing over. The English and Welsh longbow archers of this period was something the world had not quite seen before, or rather, had not yet learned to fear. The longbow itself was not new, but the English system of training, the sheer scale of it, the culture of archery that ran through every village and practice green in the country was different. These were men who had been shooting since childhood, whose left arms were noticeably more developed than their right, whose draw could send a cloth-yard arrow through chain mail at 200 yards. They would, in the battles to come, change the shape of warfare. But that is still ahead of us. For now, they are simply walking toward the coast, their bows unstrung, their arrows in wrapped bundles, their eyes on whatever horizon lies before them. In 1340, Edward crossed the Flanders with his fleet. On the 24th of June, near the harbor of Sluis on the Flemish coast, the English fleet encountered the French. What followed was less a naval battle in the modern sense, and more a collision of floating fortresses. French ships were lashed together in long chains, their sailors and soldiers defending them from platforms and towers. The French strategy was static. They wanted the English to come to them. Edward obliged, but his archers went first. Arrow storm. That is the only way to describe it. Thousands of shafts, falling in overlapping waves, clearing the decks of the French ships before the English soldiers ever came to board them. The French were pinned, unable to maneuver, unable to respond effectively. The battle became a slaughter. When it was over, the French had lost somewhere between 16,000 and 19,000 men. The English losses were, by comparison, small. Philip VI reportedly could not be told the news directly. A court jester had to break it to him in the form of a joke, because no one else dared. The Channel, for now, belonged to England, but Sluis, for all its horror, was not the decisive victory Edward needed. Wars are not won at sea when the prizes are thrown inland. He needed to march into France itself. He needed to meet the French army in the field and break it. That would come. But not yet. The 1340s opened with sieges and skirmishes and the exhausting, unglamorous work of attritional warfare, raiding parties, burning crops, castles changing hands, truces negotiated and then broken. Neither side could land the final blow. Both sides were running short of money. And then, in 1346, Edward made a decision that would echo through the centuries. He would cross the Channel with an army not to besiege a single town, but to march across northern France in a great sweeping raid, demonstrating his power, humiliating Philip, and forcing a battle on his own terms. He landed in Normandy in July. He marched east, burning as he went. The French came after him. The march through Normandy was not a gentle thing. An army of this period did not carry enough supplies to feed itself along. It lived off the land it passed through, which meant, in practice, that it took what it needed and burned what it could not carry. This was called a chivorci, a mounted raid conducted on a grand scale, and its purpose was partly strategic and partly psychological. Burn the crops, destroy the mills, drive away the livestock, make the people feel, in their bodies and in their daily survival, the cost of having the wrong king. The villages of Normandy paid that cost in the summer of 1346. Picture it, gently. From a distance, the orange glow on the horizon at night, the columns of smoke rising in the still summer air, the sound of bells ringing in terror from church towers and then going silent. Families fleeing down lanes with whatever they could carry. Animals scattered across empty fields. This was war as medieval commanders understood it. Not the glorious clash of knights that the troubadours sang about, but the slow, grinding destruction of everything that allowed ordinary life to continue. Edward was not cruel by the standards of his time. He was simply conducting war in the way war was conducted. It was terrible, and it worked for a while. But Philip VI was gathering his army, and it was vast. The French chivalric host of the 14th century was one of the most formidable military forces in Europe in theory. It was built around the armored knight on horseback, the chevalier, a man who had trained for war his entire life, who wore plate and mail worth more than most people earned in a decade, who rode a destrier bred for exactly this purpose. There were thousands of them, and behind them came infantry, crossbowmen, and great lords attended by their own retinues. The French believed, with some justification, that this were how battles were decided. Knights charged, lesser men scattered. The side with the most and best knights won. This belief was about to be tested. Breathe. Let your thoughts grow quieter. Edward had been moving north, trying to cross the Seine, trying to put distance between himself and the French pursuit while staying close enough to fight on ground of his own choosing. Near a small village called Cris-en-Ponthieu, in the county of Ponthieu land that Edward himself held through inheritance, he stopped. He chose his ground with care. The English army took up position on a long, gentle ridge. Edward divided his force into 3 divisions. The first, the vanguard, the place of greatest honor and greatest danger, he gave to his 16-year-old son, Edward of Woodstock, the boy who would become known to history as the Black Prince. 16 years old, standing on a ridge in northern France, waiting. The archers were placed in formation between and ahead of the dismounted knights, a decision that seems unremarkable to us now but was, at the time, a profound statement about how Edward intended to fight. His knights would not charge. They would wait. The archers would do the work first. They dug small pits in front of their positions and shallow holes to catch the legs of charging horses. Then they waited. The French army arrived in the late afternoon of the 26th of August, 1346. After a long march, their horses tired, their formation ragged. Philip's commanders urged him to wait to rest, to organize, to attack in the morning when the army was fresh and ordered. Philip hesitated, and in that hesitation, the front ranks of the French, the great lords, the proud knights who would not be seen to hang back, began to press forward. The army was too large and too eager and too proud to stop. They attacked. The French crossbowmen went first. They were Genoese mercenaries, professional soldiers, experienced and capable. But they had marched hard, and their bowstrings were damp from a sudden rainstorm that had swept across the field. Their bolts fell short. The English archers replied, "Let your body be still." What happened next was unlike anything the French had seen in battle. The longbowmen, thousands of them, standing in their formations on the ridge, drew and loosened volleys, not one man at a time, but together, in rhythm, so that the arrows did not come in ones and twos, but in waves, arcing overhead and falling almost vertically on the crowded ranks below. The Genoese crossbowmen broke. They turned and ran, and the French knights, furious at this disorder, rode them down, cut through their own retreating mercenaries to get to the English line. Then they met the arrows. A charging horse presents a large target. The arrows of the English longbow, at that range, could pierce armor, could bring down a horse. And when a horse falls at full gallop, rider and animal go down together in a terrible catastrophe of weight and speed, and the men behind cannot always stop in time, and the fallen become obstacles, and the obstacles become a trap. The French charged, and were broken, and charged again. They charged, by some accounts, 15 times. Each time the arrows came. Each time the horses fell. Each time the knights who reached the English line on foot, exhausted and unhorsed, met the dismounted English men-at-arms who had been waiting, rested, for exactly this moment. The grass of the ridge grew slippery. The light faded. The French dead accumulated in drifts. In the French ranks that evening was a king who could not see the battle he was losing. John of Bohemia, King of Bohemia, Count of Luxembourg, one of the most celebrated knights in Europe, was blind. He had been blind for years, the sight gone from some illness or wound no chronicle record precisely. He was old by the standards of the time. He had no real stake in this fight beyond honor and the bond of chivalry that had brought him here in service to his ally Philip, when the battle was already lost. When the French were already broken, John of Bohemia called his knights to him. He asked them to tie their horses' reins to his to ride with him, together, so that he might strike at least one blow, so that he might not die having failed to fight. They tied their horses together. They rode into the English line. They did not come back. When his body was found the next morning, he was still surrounded by his knights, their horses' reins still knotted together. They had died as they had ridden beside their king, who could not see, and who had ridden into darkness anyway. Edward the Black Prince, 16 years old, who had held his section of the line against everything the French threw at it, took John's crest as his own. 3 white ostrich feathers. The motto, ICHDN, I serve. It is the crest of the Prince of Wales to this day. Philip VI fled the field wounded. His horse had been killed under him twice. He reached a nearby castle in the night and was let in. When asked who was knocking at the gate, he reportedly answered, "The fortune of France." The morning after Crecy, Edward walked the field. 11 princes lay dead, 1,200 knights. Countless thousands of ordinary soldiers, the flower of French chivalry, as the chronicles would say, and it was not poetic exaggeration. The men who had died were the most expensively trained, most elaborately equipped warriors in the kingdom. They had died in the grass, unhorsed and helpless, under arrows fired by men who would never be invited to sit at a king's table. The world had shifted. It had not finished shifting yet. But something had changed at Crecy that could not be unchanged. In 1347, a fleet of Genoese trading ships arrived at the port of Messina, in Sicily. The sailors aboard were dying. Those who were not yet dead were covered in black swellings, hard, swollen masses in the armpits and groin and neck, some the size of an egg, some larger, that oozed blood and pus. The men had fevers that burned without breaking. They were confused and frightened, and most of them would be dead within days. The harbor master ordered the ships out of port immediately. It was too late. The sickness they carried spread through Messina within weeks. By the end of the year it had reached the Italian mainland Pisa, Genoa, Venice. It moved along trade routes with the efficiency of commerce, carried by fleas on rats on ships, entering every port city that the Mediterranean connected, which is to say, nearly every city worth naming. By 1348 it had crossed the Alps into France. By the summer of that year it had reached Paris. By August it had crossed the Channel. We call it the Black Death. The people living through it called it simply the pestilence or the great mortality. They had no word adequate to what was happening, because nothing adequate had ever happened before. Breathe slowly. You are safe. This is only history long past, long still. The plague that swept through Europe in 1347 to 1351 was, in the careful reckoning of historians, one of the most catastrophic events in human history. In 4 years, it killed somewhere between a third and a half of the entire population of Europe. A third to a half. In France alone, perhaps 8 million people died. In England, perhaps 2 million. In some towns and villages, every single person was dead within weeks. Monasteries were found empty, the monks all gone, the bells silent, the gardens untended. Roads that had been busy with merchants and pilgrims fell quiet. Fields that had been plowed for generations were simply abandoned, the furrows growing over with grass, the boundaries of ownership becoming meaningless when there was no one left to own. The people who lived through it wrote about it in ways that are still difficult to read. Giovanni Boccaccio, the Italian writer who survived the plague in Florence, described the dead being loaded onto carts at dawn, collected from doorsteps where families had placed them in the night. He described animals that ate the clothing of dead men, and then fell dead themselves within hours. He described people who woke in the morning feeling well, and were dead by evening. He wrote the Decameron in the shadow of all of this, a collection of stories told by survivors sheltering in a country house outside Florence, entertaining one another while the city below them died. Stories as a way of enduring. Narrative as a form of survival. Let your body sink a little deeper. In England, in France, in every kingdom the plague touched, the first response was bewilderment. This was an age of deep religious faith, and the question that screamed beneath every death was a theological one. Why? What had humanity done to deserve this? What sin, what collective failure of devotion or morality had brought God's wrath down in this particular and intimate form, not as flood or fire, but as something that entered your body and destroyed it from within? The answers people reached were not always kind ones. Jewish communities across Europe were accused of poisoning wells and were massacred in their hundreds in city after city, a grotesque and murderous irony, since the plague killed Jewish people at exactly the same rate as everyone else. The accusations required no evidence and admitted no contradiction. Fear, in sufficient quantities, does not ask for evidence. Groups of men called flagellants moved through towns and cities, beating themselves with leather straps and iron-tipped cords, offering their own suffering as penance on behalf of humanity. They drew crowds. They drew fear. The church eventually condemned them, worried not without reason that a movement offering individual salvation outside church authority was a challenge to institutional power even in the middle of catastrophe. The Pope, Clement VI, sat in his palace at Avignon between two enormous fires, on the advice of his physicians, for weeks. The heat, they believed, would drive away the corrupted air that carried the sickness. It may have helped. He survived the war, almost as a side effect. Stopped. In 1347, Edward had laid siege to Calais, a long, grinding siege, the town surrounded by a vast English encampment, the inhabitants slowly starving while Philip VI tried and failed to relieve them. Calais fell in August of that year, and Edward allowed the townspeople to live on the condition that 6 of the leading citizens present themselves at the city gates in their bare feet, with ropes around their necks, to submit to his mercy. They did. He spared them reportedly at the urging of his queen, Philippa, who was pregnant, and pleaded for their lives. The moment was painted and sculpted and commemorated for centuries. 6 men with ropes around their necks, kneeling in a conquered city. The sculptor Rodin captured it, hundreds of years later, in bronze 6 figures, each alone in their fear and resignation, none of them heroic, all of them simply human. Then the plague came, and Calais barely mattered. A truce was agreed in 1347. Both sides were too ravaged to fight. The armies that had marched and bled encamped in the field of northern France simply dissolved, the men going home to find their families reduced, their villages hollowed, their world rearranged in ways that no military victory or defeat could have achieved. The plague did not only kill people, it killed arrangements. The feudal system, that elaborate hierarchy of obligation, in which peasants owed labor to lords who owed service to kings, was built on the assumption that labor was plentiful and land was scarce. After the Black Death, the opposite was briefly, dramatically true. There were half the people. The land was still there. Surviving laborers could demand wages. They could move. They could negotiate. They could, for a window of time, refuse. Lords and kings attempted to legislate this way. The English Parliament passed the Statute of Labourers in 1351, trying to fix wages at pre-plague levels, trying to force the survivors back into their old places. It was partially effective and deeply resented, and its resentment would accumulate for a generation until it found its expression in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, a story for another night, but one that grows directly from the soil the plague disturbed. The church, too, was changed. It had not protected its people. Its priests had died alongside everyone else. The theological answers it offered sin, penance, submission had not stopped the dying. And into the silence left by this failure, questions began to grow. Quiet questions, at first, barely audible beneath the weight of grief. But questions, once they start, are difficult to stop. The night is very quiet now. In the years after the plague, Europe was different. Not destroyed humans are not so easily destroyed but altered, in the way that a person is altered by great loss. Still recognizably themselves. Still moving through the world. But carrying something new, something that had not been there before, that changed the quality of every silence. France had lost millions of people. England had lost millions. The 2 kingdoms that had been so eager to fight each other in 1337 were quieter now. Their populations thinned. Their energies turned inward toward the enormous work of survival and recovery. The war would resume. These things always resume. The claims and the grievances and the wounded pride of kings do not die as easily as people do. But for a moment, a decade, almost there was something close to stillness. Fields unplowed, bells not rung, roads gone quiet, and the survivors breathing the air which was just air, and finding it enough. The origins of that name are obscure. Some say it came from the color of his armor. Some say it came from the terror he inspired in those who face him. The chronicles of his own time do not use it appears later, as a way of distinguishing him from his father, and from the brightness of the royal court, and perhaps from something in his nature that his contemporaries sensed but did not quite put into words. He was, by all accounts, a formidable man, a gifted commander, a knight of extraordinary personal courage. He was also capable of a cold and systematic brutality when he judged it necessary, a quality that would become relevant and troubling as the war went on. But in the summer of 1356, he was riding north through the heart of France with an army, conducting another great chevauchée, burning and raiding as his father had done a decade before. He had come up from Gascony, the English territory in the south, and he had swept a wide swathe of destruction through Languedoc and the Berry and the Loire Valley. He had gone far, perhaps too far. Breathe slowly. Let the warmth hold you. The new French king was John II, John the Good. He was called, a title that referred to his chivalric qualities rather than his political competence, and which would prove, in the months ahead, to be almost tragically ironic. He was brave. He was proud. He had the absolute conviction of a man who had been told since birth that he was anointed by God to rule. He was also, as a military commander, not especially gifted. When John learned that the Black Prince was in his kingdom, burning his towns and riding toward the Loire, he gathered his army with impressive speed. He had more men than the English. He had the finest knights in France. He had the memory of Crécy, yes, but also the burning need to erase and to demonstrate that Crécy had been an anomaly, a bad day, a failure of command rather than a failure of French arms. He marched south. He nearly cut the Black Prince off. Near the city of Poitiers, in the Loire Valley, the two armies found each other. The English were outnumbered, perhaps 2-1. The Black Prince attempted to negotiate not from weakness, but because he was a long way from home with a hungry army and a great deal of plunder he preferred not to lose. He offered to return the towns he had taken. He offered to promise not to fight France for 7 years. John the Good refused. He wanted a battle. He wanted to be the king who undid Crécy. The 7th of September, 1356, was a Sunday. Both sides, by the conventions of the time, observed a truce on the Lord's Day. They faced each other across the fields outside Poitiers and did not fight. On the Monday, they fought. The English position was good a ridge again, with a hedge along its front edge, vineyards on the flanks, a marshy stream protecting one side. The Black Prince had learned from his father. He dismounted his knights. He placed his archers on the wings, where they could pour arrows into the flanks of anything approaching down the middle. The French attacked in 3 divisions, one after another. The first division was commanded by the Dauphin John's eldest son, the Crown Prince of France. His knights dismounted and walked forward, a tactical adjustment meant to avoid the disaster of Crécy, where cavalry had been cut down by arrows. They reached the hedge. They fought. They were pushed back, with terrible losses, and the Dauphin was led from the field by his advisers before he could be captured or killed. The second division came on. It too was broken. Then something strange happened. Let your body be still. Let the story carry you. The third division, the largest, commanded by John the Good himself, watched the first 2 broken, and kept coming. It was an act of courage, or pride, or the particular blindness that afflicts men who have decided what they believe before they have seen the evidence. The Black Prince, watching from the ridge, made a decision. He attacked, not a defensive stand, not an arrow storm in a waiting line. He took his mounted knights held in reserve until this moment and swept around the French flank while his men-at-arms came down from a ridge on foot. The French, who had been fighting uphill and were already exhausted and disordered by the repulse of the previous two divisions, found themselves struck from two directions at once. The line collapsed. John the Good fought on foot in the press of the battle, surrounded by his knights, his golden armor marking him clearly to everyone who could see him. His youngest son, Philip, 14 years old, who would grow up to be Philip the Bold and would shape France for another generation, fought beside his father, reportedly crying warnings. "Father, guard left. Father, guard right." They were surrounded. The fighting around the king was described by chroniclers as a chaotic melee, men shouting in French and English and Gascon, everyone trying to reach the golden figure at the center, everyone wanting to be the one who took the greatest prisoner in the world. John the Good surrendered to a Gascon knight. He was helped from the field, exhausted and unhurt. His son Philip was beside him. The King of France had been captured in battle. The Black Prince received his prisoner with a ceremony that is one of the stranger moments of the war. That evening, at the English camp, the Black Prince hosted a dinner. John the Good sat at the high table, in the place of honor. The Black Prince served impersonally, kneeling to offer food and wine, refusing to sit in the king's presence. He said, according to the chronicler Froissart, who may have improved the words but probably captured the spirit, that John had conducted himself so nobly in the battle that he deserved the highest honor, regardless of the outcome. It was a performance of chivalric virtue, and it was also a negotiation. A captured king was worth an enormous ransom. Treating him well was not only courtesy, it was investment. John the Good was taken to England, to comfortable captivity in the Savoy Palace in London and then at Windsor. He was given his own household, his own servants, the ability to receive visitors and conduct some correspondence. He was, in the language of the time, a prisoner on parole, his word, his bond, his comfort a reflection of his value. He stayed for 4 years. In France, the absence of a king left something close to chaos. The Dauphin, the eldest son who had been led from the field at Poitiers, now ruled as regent. He was 19. He had watched his father's army destroyed and his father taken prisoner, and he inherited a kingdom that was exhausted, humiliated, and increasingly ungovernable. The peasants of northern France rose in a great and terrible revolt in 1358 to Jacquerie, named mockingly for the common name Jacques, the everyman of the French fields. They burned castles. They killed nobles. They were suppressed with a matching brutality, their leaders executed, their villages burned in return. The violence went in all directions. Like a fire in a granary, it consumed everything it touched and left nothing clean behind. The Dauphin negotiated. He managed. He held the kingdom together through a combination of careful politics and the simple fact that no one had a better claim to be holding it. He was not charismatic. He was not a warrior. He was something possibly more useful in this particular crisis. He was patient and intelligent, and he watched and he learned. His name was Charles. History would call him Charles the Wise. But that, too, is for later. In the spring of 1360, the two sides met near the village of Bretigny, in the flat farming country south of Paris. The negotiations were not simple. They were never simple. But the pressures on both sides were real. John the Good was still a prisoner in England, his ransom unpaid, his kingdom ungoverned. The Dauphin Charles was managing, but managing is a word that implies constant effort and little joy. Edward III was wealthy with ransoms and plunder, but maintaining the machinery of war across the Channel was expensive in ways that did not always show up in the treasury accounts, in men, in loyalty, in the quiet erosion of a kingdom's patience. So they talked, and eventually they agreed. The Treaty of Bretigny was signed in May of 1360, and it was, on paper, a remarkable English achievement. France ceded enormous territories: Gascony, Poitou, the Limousin, Périgord, much of the southwest. In total, Roughly a third of the Kingdom of France would pass under English sovereignty, not as fiefs held by vassals, but outright Edward to govern as a king, owing homage to no one. In exchange, Edward renounced his claim to the French throne. Breathe slowly. Feel the quiet. It was, if it had held, the kind of settlement that ends wars. A recognition of reality, a line drawn. It did not hold. The reasons are tangled, as the reasons of peace always are, because peace is harder to maintain than war, requiring constant attention and a willingness to absorb small grievances without reaching for a sword. But at Bretigny, there was a particular and almost elegant flaw built into the treaty's structure. The renunciations, Edward's renunciation of the French throne, and France's formal cession of the territories were written into the treaty, but they were placed in a separate clause. They were to be formalized later, in a separate document, once the initial exchange of territory had taken place. Later never quite came. Edward delayed formalizing his renunciation. The French dragged their feet on completing the territorial transfers. Each side waited for the other to move first. The separate clause sat unfinished, like a door left slightly open, letting in a draft that would eventually become a gale. Lawyers noticed. Diplomats noticed. And the kings, those watchful, patient, long-memored men noticed too, and said nothing, and filed it away. John the Good was released in 1360, on the agreement that his ransom 3 million gold écus, a sum almost incomprehensible in its scale, will be paid in installments. He returned to France a diminished man, not in dignity but in power. The kingdom that greeted him was not the one he had left. He tried. He raised taxes. He struggled with a nobility that had grown used to the regent's more consultative style. He struggled with a people ground thin by plague and war and the additional devastation of the routes, the free companies, those armies of unemployed soldiers who, in the absence of war to fight, had simply continued fighting for pay wherever they could find it, turning the countryside of southern France into something close to a permanent state of low-level catastrophe. The routes were one of the war's most persistent and least celebrated consequences. When armies were stood down, the men did not simply go home and become farmers. They had no other skill. Violence was their livelihood, and they hired it out to whoever would pay. And when no one was paying, they took what they needed from the villages they passed through. Whole regions of France, the Loire Valley, the Auvergne, the roads between towns were effectively ungovernable, controlled by shifting bands of armed men flying no particular flag. Charles the Regent tried to deal with them. He hired some to get them out of France. He negotiated with others. He watched and he waited and he built, quietly, the administrative structures that would eventually allow France to field a different kind of army, a permanent army, paid by the state, loyal to the crown, rather than the feudal levy of nobles and the mercenary chaos of the free companies. It would take time. Everything took time. Let your breathing slow a little more. In 1364, John the Good died. He had returned voluntarily to English captivity the year before one of his sons, held as a hostage to guarantee the ransom payments, had escaped, and John considered himself honor-bound to return in his place. It was an act of chivalric principle that strikes the modern reader as almost incomprehensible, returning to prison because the rules of chivalry demanded it, because a king's word was more valuable than a king's freedom. He died in London in April 1364, and was mourned in both kingdoms, because even the English, who had captured and ransomed him, respected the dignity with which he had carried his captivity. He was 45 years old. Charles became King of France. Charles V. Charles the Wise. He was 30 years old, and he was not a warrior. A childhood illness had left him with a physical fragility that made it impossible for him to fight in the way his father and grandfather had. He could not lead a cavalry charge. He could not put on armor and present himself on the battlefield as a symbol of royal power. He did something more dangerous instead. He thought, The war resumed, as everyone with clear eyes had known it would. The spark, when it came, was almost administrative in its origins. The Black Prince had been given Gascony to govern after Bretigny, and he governed it with a combination of military brilliance and fiscal ruthlessness that characterized everything he did. To fund a campaign in Spain where English interests intersected with the Castilian succession dispute, he levied a half-tax on the Gascon nobility, a tax on every fireplace, every household, every small warmth against the cold. The Gascon nobles appealed to Charles of France. They claimed he was still, despite Bretigny, their sovereign lord. Charles accepted the appeal. Technically, under the unfinished renunciation clause, he may have been right. The door that had been left open in 1360 had never been closed. In 1369, Edward III formally reasserted his claim to the French throne. The war, which had never really ended in the South, was now officially resumed everywhere. But the war that resumed in 1369 was different from the war that had paused in 1360. Charles the Wise had spent his years of regency learning. He had watched the disasters at Crécy and Poitiers and had drawn the obvious conclusion: the French nobility could not be trusted to fight intelligently. Their pride, their hunger for personal glory, their absolute conviction that a frontal charge by armored knights was a correct answer to every military problem, all of it had killed them in their thousands and accomplished nothing. Charles did not abolish the nobility. He could not, but he found a general. His name was Bertrand du Guesclin, a Breton knight of undistinguished birth and extraordinary instinct, ugly by the accounts of everyone who met him, brave in a way that seemed almost indifferent to personal consequence, and possessed of a tactical intelligence that recognized something the French had refused to see for 30 years. Don't fight the English in the open field. Don't let them choose the ground. Don't let them set up their archers on a ridge and wait. Don't charge. Don't give them the battle they want. Instead move, harass, raid, take back towns and castles one at a time through siege and surprise and the slow erosion of English supply lines. Make English rule of the ceded territory so costly, so exhausting, so ungovernable, that England would find the prize not worth holding. It was not glorious. The chroniclers struggled with it. The poets had no good language for a war conducted in shadows and skirmishes and the patient reclamation of fortresses. But it worked. By the mid-1370s, England had lost almost everything Bretigny had given it. The great territories of the southwest shrank. Town by town, the English garrisons were dislodged or worn down. The Black Prince, who might have answered du Guesclin with the brilliance that had won Poitiers, was dying a wasting illness, probably dysentery, that had hollowed him out over years. He returned to England in 1371, carried on a litter, the brightness of his reputation preceding him into the shadow of his dying. He died in 1376, a year before his father. Edward III outlived his greatest son by 12 months, dying in 1377, leaving the throne to a 10-year-old boy. His name was Richard, and that is a long and sad story for another time. We are moving forward in time now a generation, almost two. The great figures of the war's first phase are gone. Edward III, his brilliant and ruined son, the captured French king who chose captivity over dishonor. Charles the Wise, who recovered France so patiently, died in 1380. The war has been grinding on in its quieter, uglier phase, skirmishes and sieges, and the slow misery of occupied territories. In England, a boy king has grown into a troubled man. Richard II, grandson of Edward III, is deposed by his own cousin in 1399 and dies in captivity, perhaps starved, perhaps murdered. The chronicles are careful not to say, and the cousin takes the throne as Henry IV. A new dynasty, a new name, the House of Lancaster, and a new king's son who will become, in the memory of England, something close to myth. Henry V came to the throne of England in 1413, at the age of 25. The chronicles and the Shakespeare play have made him so familiar that it is worth pausing to look at him clearly, without the gilding. He was short by the standards of his time. He was lean and hard-faced, with a long nose and close-cropped hair and the kind of physical fitness that comes from spending your adolescence on military campaigns rather than in court. He had, as a teenager, taken an arrow to the face of the Battle of Shrewsbury, the arrowhead entering below his eye and lodging in the bone of the back of his skull, and had survived the removal of it by a surgeon who used a specially designed tool to extract it over several agonizing sessions. He was not a man who had been sheltered from what the world could do. He was also ferociously intelligent, deeply religious, and possessed of a political instinct that his father had never quite managed. He understood that a king needed a war not merely for territory, but for the attention of his nobility. A noble class kept occupied fighting the French was a noble class not conspiring at home. He looked at France and saw opportunity. Breathe slowly. Let the warmth hold you. France in 1413 was fracturing from within. The French king, Charles VI, was mad. This is not a metaphor or a diplomatic euphemism. Charles VI suffered from recurring episodes of severe mental illness, beginning in 1392 when he had ridden into the forest in delusional state and killed several of his own knights before being restrained. He had periods of lucidity, but they were increasingly brief, and in his worst episodes he did not recognize his own wife or children, believed himself to be made of glass and feared he would shatter if touched, and had to be kept from injuring himself and others by a rotating staff of attendants. A mad king created a power vacuum, and into vacuums, factions always flow. The great nobles of France divided into two camps, the Armagnacs, led by the Count of Armagnac and allied with the Dauphin, and the Burgundians, led by the Duke of Burgundy, a powerful lord whose territories in the east and north made him almost a king in his own right. These two factions hated each other with a particular venom of people who are competing for the same prize, and their hatred spilled out of the courts and into the streets of Paris, where actual street battles were fought between armed partisans. France was fighting itself. Henry V looked at this and began to plan. He landed in Normandy in August 1415 with an army of perhaps 10,000 men. He besieged the port of Harfleur, a long and costly siege, the town eventually surrendering in September. But the siege had taken longer than expected, and his army had been badly depleted by dysentery. He made a decision that looked, to his commanders, like recklessness. He would march to Calais, overland, through Normandy and Picardy, 400 miles of French territory, with an army reduced by sickness to perhaps 6,000 men, with winter coming on and supply lines non-existent. His commanders advised against it. Henry marched anyway. The French army gathered to cut him off. It was enormous. Estimates range from 12,000 to as high as 36,000 men, though the larger figures are probably chronicle exaggeration. It was certainly far larger than Henry's force. It positioned itself across his line of march near a castle called Agincourt, in the flat farming country of Picardy. On the evening of the 24th of October, 1415, the two armies made their camps within sight of each other's fires. The French outnumbered the English badly enough that their commanders were already discussing how they would divide the ransom money from the prisoners they expected to take the following morning. Let your body be still. Let the night be kind. It had rained. The field between the two armies was a recently plowed stretch of farmland, and the rain had turned it into a deep, clinging mud, the kind that grabs at the feet and refuses to let go, that sucks at the legs of horses, that turns a simple act of walking into an act of constant effort. For lightly armored archers, this was manageable. For heavily armored knights, walking in plate armor that weighed 60 or 70 pounds, sinking to the ankle with every step, it was something close to a trap. In the morning, Henry advanced. He moved his line forward until his archers were within extreme range of the French, roughly 300 yards, and there he stopped and had them drive sharpened stakes into the mud in front of their positions, angled outward, to break any cavalry charge. Then he waited. The French did not charge immediately. They stood in their formations. Crowded together, they had so many men that the field could not easily accommodate them, and they waited too. A standoff, the two armies staring at each other across a muddy field on a gray October morning. Henry's men were hungry. They had been marching for weeks. Many were sick. They could not stand here indefinitely. Henry ordered his archers to loose. The first volley of arrows crossed the field. The French cavalry, stung into action, charged. They hit the mud. They hit the stakes. They hit the arrows, which came in waves as they always had, as they had at Crécy and Poitiers, the same terrible geometry of trajectory and mass, the horses going down, the riders falling in the mud and struggling to rise in their heavy armor. The cavalry broke and fled back through their own infantry, disordering the ranks, pushing men aside, turning formation into a crowd. The French infantry came on anyway, walking through mud, in armor, toward archers who were loosing as fast as they could draw. The men who reached the English line were exhausted, encased in mud-heavy armor, barely able to lift their arms. The English archers, having expended their arrows, drew their mallets and short swords and fought in the press. The battle became a massacre. Men were pushed down in the mud and could not rise and were killed where they lay, or suffocated under the weight of others falling on top of them. The chronicles describe men drowning in mud, in puddles, in the press of bodies, still alive inside their armor with no way out. It was not glorious. It was not the bright crash of chivalric combat that the songs described. It was filthy and close and merciless, and it lasted perhaps 2 hours. When it was over, the flower of French nobility lay dead in the mud of a plowed field in Picardy. The Constable of France, 3 dukes, 5 counts, 90 lords, perhaps 6,000 men-at-arms. The English dead numbered, by the most generous accounts, a few hundred. There is a moment in the battle that must be told, because it sits in the memory of everyone who has read about Agincourt, and it cannot be passed over. At some point during the fighting, word reached Henry that the French were attacking his baggage train at the rear, threatening his supplies, and perhaps moving to fall on the English from behind. Henry, surrounded by prisoners and faced with the possibility of fighting on 2 fronts, gave an order: kill the prisoners. It was a war crime by the standards of the time, though that language is anachronistic. It violated the laws of chivalry, which promised captured noblemen safety in exchange for ransom. Henry's own knights refused the order. It was dishonorable, they said. Henry had to use lesser soldiers to carry it out. Hundreds of French prisoners, men who had already surrendered, were killed in the confusion. The attack on the baggage train turned out to be a local raid, not a coordinated assault. The threat that had justified the order was smaller than it had seemed. Henry never publicly expressed regret. He was a king who had made a calculation, and kings who second-guessed their calculations did not tend to remain kings. It is one of the things history remembers alongside the victory: the mud and the arrows, and the order to kill the men who had already surrendered. Henry marched to Calais. He sailed home. England celebrated. He returned to France in 1417 and began the systematic conquest of Normandy, town by town, castle by castle, with a patience and organization that was in some ways more impressive than Agincourt. By 1419 he controlled Normandy entirely. By 1420 he had achieved something no English king had managed: the Treaty of Troyes, by which the Mad King of France, manipulated by the Burgundian faction, agreed that Henry would marry his daughter Catherine, and that Henry, not the French Dauphin, would inherit the French crown upon Charles VI's death. The dream that Edward III had dreamed 70 years before had been reduced to paper and signed. Henry V, King of England, was heir to France. The child became King Henry VI of England and, by the terms of Troyes, King of France as well. He was crowned in both kingdoms before he was old enough to understand what a crown was. A baby king, an occupied country, a war with no end in sight. And in a small village in the east of France, a girl was listening to something no one else could hear. Her name was Jehan. We call her Joan. She was born around 1412 in Domremy, a village on the River Meuse in the Duchy of Lorraine, a place so small and ordinary that it is remarkable only for what left it. Her father was a prosperous peasant, which is to say he owned enough land to be comfortable and enough animals to be envied. Her mother was devout in the practical, daily way of rural medieval faith, the prayers at rising, the saints' days observed, the church at the center of the week shape. Joan grew up in a country at war, which in practice meant she grew up knowing that soldiers might come through, that crops might be burned, that the ordinary rhythms of village life could be interrupted at any moment by the large and incomprehensible decisions of people in distant castles. Domremy was in a disputed border region. She had seen her village raided. She had seen families displaced. She was, by the accounts of those who knew her, a normal child in most respects. Pious, helpful, good with animals. She did not learn to read. She learned to sew and spin. She played with the other village children in the fields along the river. When she was approximately 13, she heard a voice. Breathe. Let the quiet deepen. She described it later, under examination, with a precision and consistency that is remarkable. A voice sometimes accompanied by light, sometimes by what she perceived as the presence of figures she came to identify as St. Michael, St. Catherine, and St. Margaret. The voices told her she had a mission, that she was chosen, that she must go to the Dauphin, the uncrowned French prince, Charles, who held the remnant of the kingdom south of the Loire, and that she must help him drive the English from France. She was a peasant girl. She was illiterate. She was, when the voices first came to her, perhaps 13 years old. She told no one for several years. The voices continued. They became more insistent. They told her the time was coming. And in 1429, when she was perhaps 17, she decided to go. What followed is one of the most extraordinary journeys in medieval history, not because of what she accomplished, which was remarkable enough, but because of what she had to overcome simply to be taken seriously. She presented herself to the local lord, Robert de Baudricourt, and told him she needed an escort to take her to the Dauphin. He laughed at her. She came back. He laughed again. She came back a third time, and something in her persistence or in the state of the war, which was desperate enough to make even implausible options worth considering, convinced him to give her what she asked. She cut her hair. She put on men's clothing practical for riding, and perhaps for something else, some statement about the kind of person she was choosing to be. She rode with a small escort across 300 miles of contested, dangerous territory to reach the Dauphin's court at Chinon. Charles, the Dauphin, received her with a test. He dressed an ordinary nobleman in royal clothes and had himself stand anonymously in the crowd to see if this girl who claimed divine guidance could identify him. Joan walked past the decoy and went directly to Charles. Whether this was a miracle or simply good intelligence, she had had time to observe the court before the audience the chronicles do not resolve. It doesn't matter. The effect was what mattered. She was examined by a panel of theologians and churchmen who questioned her for weeks about the nature of her voices, her faith, her character. It was an interrogation dressed as inquiry, and it was conducted by men who had every reason to be skeptical of a peasant girl claiming divine commission. They found nothing they could condemn. She was orthodox in her faith. She was consistent in her account. She was, by all report, impossible to rattle calm under questioning, precise in her answers, unintimidated by men who had spent their lives acquiring the authority she simply seemed to possess naturally. They recommended that the Dauphin make use of her. Charles gave her armor. He gave her a banner white, embroidered with the names of Jesus and Mary, and the image of God in judgment attended by angels. He gave her a horse. He sent her to Orleans. Orleans was dying. The English and their Burgundian allies had besieged the city since October 1428. 6 months of encirclement, the English fortresses ringing the city, the supply lines cut, the population slowly starving. Orleans was the last major stronghold north of the Loire still holding for the Dauphin. If it fell, the south would be open. The war, for France, would be functionally over. Joan arrived in late April 1429 with a relief column carrying supplies. What happened over the next 8 days was so rapid and so complete that contemporaries struggled to explain it in any terms other than the ones Joan herself offered. She led charges against the English fortifications. She was wounded by an arrow through the shoulder, above the breast, and returned to the fight the same day. The English, who had held their position for months against French attacks, were driven from one fortress after another. On the 8th of May, the English lifted the siege and withdrew. Orleans was free. Let your body sink a little deeper. Let the warmth hold you. The relief of Orleans was not only a military event. It was a rupture in the psychological landscape of the war. The English had seemed, in France, like an inevitable force, something to be endured, managed, outlasted, but not reversed. Crecy, Poitiers, Agincourt, these victories had built a myth of English invincibility in the field, a sense that fighting them directly was simply losing slowly. Joan had fought them directly and won in 8 days. The effect on French morale was incalculable. The effect on English morale was a mirror image. She rode with the Dauphin's army up the Loire Valley, and town after town fell Jajot, Monceau, Beaugency, at Bataille. The French cavalry caught an English army before it could set up its defensive positions, before the archers could hammer their stakes into the ground, and cut through it in minutes. It was Agincourt reversed the arrowmen overrun before they could knock their shafts, the old formula finally broken. By July, the army was marching on Reims. Reims was where the kings of France were crowned. It was deep in English-held territory. Taking, it seemed, to most of Joan's contemporaries, like an ambition just to the far side of possible. They took it in 2 weeks. On the 17th of July, 1429, Charles VII was crowned King of France in the cathedral at Reims, in the full ceremony of the French monarchy, with Joan of Arc standing beside him holding her white banner. She had done what the voices had told her to do. She should, perhaps, have gone home. But the war was not over, and Joan knew it, and she pressed on. She attempted to take Paris in September 1429, and failed, the assault repulsed. Joan wounded again, the Dauphin's support beginning to waver. Charles was king now. He had what he needed. Joan's usefulness to him was becoming, in the cold arithmetic of court politics, less clear. In May 1430, outside the town of Compiègne, Joan was unhorsed during a skirmish and captured by Burgundian soldiers. She was sold to the English. Rouen was an English city in 1430, the capital of English Normandy, heavily garrisoned, the seat of English administration in France. It was the obvious place to take a prisoner the English wanted to destroy carefully, legally, and in public. Joan was held in the castle of Bouvres, in a cell, chained at times by the ankle to a heavy block of wood. She was guarded by English soldiers, men, not women, which was a deliberate violation of the Church's customary practice of housing female prisoners in the care of nuns. It was also, almost certainly, a deliberate cruelty. She was 19 years old. She had been sold to the English by the Burgundians for 10,000 livres, the standard ransom price for a high-value prisoner. The English had paid it gladly. a girl who had broken their siege of Orleans, who had crowned the French king, who had become in the mind of the French a living sign of divine favor. For their cause, this girl had to be destroyed, not simply killed, destroyed in a way that undid her meaning, that reframed everything she had done as the work of the devil rather than of God. That required a trial. Breathe slowly. You are safe. This is 600 years gone. The trial of Joan of Arc began in January 1431 and lasted for months. It was presided over by Pierre Cauchon, the Bishop of Beauvais, a French churchman who had aligned himself with the English and Burgundian cause and who had a personal interest in Joan's condemnation, since it was in his diocese that she had been captured. He was not a stupid man or a simple villain. He was a man who had made his choices and needed them to be right, and that need shaped everything that followed. The charges were heresy and sorcery. Both were capital offenses under church law. Both were, in the hands of skilled inquisitors, elastic enough to fit almost any behavior if the framing was sufficiently controlled. Joan had no lawyer. She had no advisor. She faced her interrogators alone, day after day, in a room full of learned men whose purpose was not to discover the truth, but to construct a usable falsehood. And yet the records of the trial would survive in remarkable completeness, because the English wanted a thorough legal record they could cite afterward show something extraordinary. She was very difficult to trap. The interrogators tried. They tried with the skill and patience of men who had done this before, who knew how to lead a witness toward contradiction, how to let silence become confession, how to make an ordinary statement sound like an admission. Joan answered carefully. When they asked her whether she was in God's grace a trap, since claiming certainty of salvation was theologically presumptuous, but denying it would suggest doubt in her mission, she said, "If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may God keep me in it." The notaries, who were supposed to be recording a heresy trial, noted that the interrogators were struck silent by the answer. When they asked her about her men's clothing, wearing men's dress was a specific violation of church law, she said she wore it because she was surrounded by men and it was safer. When they pressed her further, she said she wore it because God had told her to. She would not give them the contradiction they needed. When they asked her whether she would submit her actions to the judgment of the church, she drew a distinction that showed a theological sophistication none of them had expected. She would submit to the church on oath in all things, she said, except those in which God had directly commanded her, because no earthly authority stood above God. It was the answer of a mystic and a logician simultaneously, and it frustrated them for weeks. Let your body be still. Let the warmth hold you. They were not ultimately frustrated by her answers. They were frustrated by their own process, which kept producing a record of a 19-year-old girl holding her own against the finest ecclesiastical minds in English-occupied France. This was not what the record was supposed to show. Eventually, the pressure shifted. Joan had been ill. She had been in chains, in a cold cell, for months, with soldiers at her door and no friendly face in the room. She was threatened with torture, the instrument shown to her, the possibility made explicit, and she was told, in terms she could understand, that if she recanted, if she admitted that her voices had deceived her, she would be handed to church authorities and imprisoned rather than boned. On the 24th of May, 1431, in the cemetery of Saint-Ouen in Rouen, Joan signed a document of abjuration. She agreed that her voices had been false. She agreed that she had sinned. She was sentenced to life imprisonment. She was taken back to her cell. 3 days later, she withdrew the abjuration. The reason she gave was simple. She said her voices had returned and told her she had done wrong to deny them. She said she had signed the document out of fear, and that fear had been a kind of cowardice she could not sustain. She also resumed wearing men's clothing. Accounts differ as to whether this was her choice or whether her women's clothes were taken from her deliberately to force a violation and justify what came next. under the laws of the Inquisition. A relapsed heretic who had recanted and then returned to their heresy could not be reprieved. The path was determined. On the 30th of May, 1431, Joan of Arc was taken to the old market square in ruin. She was tied to a tall stake, on a platform high enough that the crowd could see her clearly. She asked for a cross to be held before her. An English soldier made a small cross from 2 sticks and gave it to her. She asked for the processional cross from the nearby church to be held up so she could see it through the smoke. She was 19 years old, possibly 20. The fire was lit. She called on her saints. She called on God. By the account of those present, including English soldiers who had expected to feel nothing and found themselves weeping, she called on Jesus repeatedly until she was silent. An English secretary present to the execution said afterward, in a statement that was recorded and has survived, "We are lost. We have burned a saint. The night is very quiet. Let me tell you what came after, because it matters. Charles VII, the King Joan, had crowned at Rheims, the man who had not sent a single soldier to ransom her, who had made no diplomatic effort to save her life, who had accepted her capture and her trial in silence. Charles ordered a re-examination of the trial in 1450, after Rouen had returned to French hands. The re-examination concluded, in 1456, that the trial had been corrupt, that the charges had been fabricated, that the process had violated church law at every stage, that Joan of Arc had been innocent of everything she had been condemned for. The church formally rehabilitated her. In 1920, nearly 5 centuries after her death, she was canonized, made a saint. She is the patron saint of France. She is one of the patron saints of soldiers. She is the patron saint of people who are being mocked for what they believe. The English secretary was right. In the end, they had burned a saint. But the fire in the old market square in ruin, that is not where the story ends, and it is not what defines her. What defines her is a ride from Domremy to Chinon, the 8 days at Orleans, the white band in the cathedral at Rheims, the voices she followed when no one believed her, all the way to a coronation. The fire came after. The fire is not the point. What remains is the ending. And endings, in history as in life, are rarely the clean, decisive moments we imagine them to be. They are slow. They are gradual. They are made of 100 small surrenders and retreats and quiet abandonments, until one day the thing that seemed permanent is simply gone. This is a story of how England lost France. Charles VII was not, by temperament or appearance, a heroic figure. He was thin and pale, with legs that contemporaries described as spindly and a face that portraits render as somewhat anxious, the face of a man who has spent too long wondering whether he is adequate to what is required of him. He had been called, in the desperate years before Joan arrived, the King of Boards a mockery, implying that his kingdom had shrunk to a single city. He had watched a teenage girl do in 8 days what his generals had failed to do in months. He had accepted her help and then, when she was captured, done nothing to save her. He knew what he was. He was not sentimental about it. But Charles VII was patient, and he was intelligent, and after the coronation at Rheims he had something he had not possessed before, legitimacy. He had been crowned in the cathedral where French kings were crowned, by the Archbishop of Rheims, in the full and ancient ceremony. Whatever the English said about his claim, whatever legal arguments the Treaty of Troyes assembled against him, he had been anointed. He also had, at last, the will to reform. Breathe slowly. Let the dark hold you. The reform that Charles undertook in the years after Joan's death was not dramatic. It did not make good stories. It was administrative and fiscal and military, conducted in the counting houses and councils of the kingdom rather than on battlefields, and it consisted largely of fixing things that had been broken for so long that everyone had stopped noticing they were broken. He established a permanent royal army, the company's d'ordonnance, cavalry units paid directly by the crown, loyal to the king rather than to individual nobles, subject to military discipline rather than the shifting obligations of feudal service. This sounds technical. Its consequences were enormous. For the first time, France had a professional force that could be deployed when the king decided, not when the nobles felt like fighting. He reformed the artillery. Here, too, the change was quiet in its origins and thunderous in its consequences. Two brothers, Jean and Gaspard Bureau, the master of artillery, and his brother developed a French artillery train into the most effective in Europe. Not the crude bombards that had been used to knock holes in walls for decades, but organized, mobile, rapidly reloading cannon that could be brought to bear on fortifications with a speed and accuracy that had not existed before. Castles that had held against siege for months fell in days. The whole calculus of English power in France was built on fortifications, on the network of garrisoned towns and castles that controlled the roads and the rivers. When those fortifications could no longer be relied upon to hold, the network collapsed. The Burgundians came back. This, perhaps more than anything else, decided the war. The alliance between England and Burgundy had been the foundation of English power in France since Agincourt. It had given the English the Treaty of Troyes. It had given them Paris. Without Burgundy, the English position in northern France was isolated, expensive, and dependent on a supply line across the Channel that grew more precarious every year. In 1435, at the Congress of Arras, Charles negotiated a separate peace with Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy. He offered humiliating terms. He acknowledged the murder of Philip's father, John the Fearless, on the bridge at Montereau in 1419, an act in which the Dauphin's men had been complicit, and he offered reparations and territorial concessions that cost him daily. He paid the price. Philip accepted. The English were furious. They called it treachery. They were not entirely wrong. It was a reversal of a commitment of 20 years. But Philip the Good had been watching the tide turn, and he was a practical man, and practical men do not stay on a sinking ship out of sentiment. Paris fell to French forces in 1436. Not in battle, the city's gates were opened from within, by Parisians who had been living under English occupation for 16 years and had grown tired of it. The English garrison withdrew without a major fight. The city that had been the symbolic prize of the whole war returned to French hands almost quietly, like a door swinging back on its hinges. Let your body sink a little deeper into warmth. The retreat of the English from France over the following 15 years was not a rout. It was a grinding, costly, dispiriting erosion town by town, province by province, the English garrisons holding as long as they could and then withdrawing or being overrun. The French artillery rolled from siege to siege with a relentless efficiency that the English had no answer for. Normandy, which Henry V had conquered so patiently and organized so carefully, was lost between 1449 and 1450. Rouen, where Joan had been tried and burned, fell in November 1449. Charles entered it in triumph, and one of the first things he did was order the investigation into Joan's trial that would eventually clear her name. Caen fell. Cherbourg fell. By August 1450, the English had been expelled from Normandy entirely. Gascony, that ancient English possession in the southwest, held in various forms since the 12th century, the wine country that had been English longer than many English institutions held out longer. The Gascon nobility had genuine ties to England, real commercial relationships, a loyalty that was not simply the loyalty of the occupied, but something older and more complicated. When French forces took Bordeaux in 1451, some of the citizens petitioned England to send an army to take it back. England sent John Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury. He was old, in his 60s or 70s. The chronicles are imprecise, and he had been fighting in France for most of his adult life. He was one of the last of the great English commanders of the war, a figure so formidable that the French had used his name to frighten children. Talbot is coming. He retook Bordeaux in 1452 and held it for a year. At Castillon, in the summer of 1453, the French artillery was waiting for him. The Battle of Castillon is the last battle of the 100 Years' War, though no one called it that at the time. The French had positioned their guns in a fortified camp. Talbot, receiving a confused report that the French were retreating, attacked without waiting for his full force to assemble. The guns opened. Talbot's horse was killed under him. He fell. He was killed where he lay by a French soldier who recognized him, or perhaps did not. The accounts differ. He was an old man in the mud, in the last battle of a war that had eaten his entire life. The English force was destroyed. Bordeaux surrendered for the final time in October 1453. The 100 Years' War ended not with a treaty but with exhaustion, a mutual recognition, unspoken and unsigned, that it was over. England retained only Calais, that port town Edward III had taken a century before, where 6 citizens had knelt with ropes around their necks. It would hold Calais for another 100 years before losing that too. Everything else, Normandy, Gascony, Anjou, Maine, the dream of the French throne that Edward III had stitched into his coat of arms was gone. Charles VII, the King of Bourgs, the thin, anxious man who had needed a teenage girl to crown him, had become Charles the Victorious. He had not done it with brilliance or charisma or the personal courage of a Henry V. He had done it with patience and reform, and the willingness to pay the political cost that his predecessors had always flinched from paying. He had built an army. He had built artillery. He had made peace with Burgundy when pride told him to keep fighting. He had waited, and the waiting had been its own kind of courage. He died in 1461, still king, France intact. We have watched the war run its full length. 116 years, from the war disputes of the 1330s to the guns at Castillon in 1453. We have followed kings and princes and one extraordinary girl from a village on the Meuse. We have stood at Crécy and Poitiers and Agincourt and Orleans. We have watched the plague pass through, and the free companies, and the burning of ordinary places by armies that had no particular quarrel with the ordinary people living in them. The fighting is done now. The gates of Bordeaux are closed for the last time. The fields of France are quiet. Let us sit in that quiet for a while, and look at what the 116 years left behind. The first thing the war made was France. This sounds strange, because before the war it had kings and cathedrals and cities and literature and a language. But the France that existed in 1337, when Edward III first renewed his claim to the French throne, was in many ways a collection of great lordships that happened to share a king. The Duke of Burgundy was nearly a sovereign in his own right. The Count of Flanders looked as much to trade as to the French crown for his identity. The lords of Gascony had ties to England as old and deep as their ties to Paris. The war burned all that away. Not gently, the burning was literal. In many cases, the chevauchés and the routes and the decades of violence in the countryside reducing the old complex feudal map to something simpler. And into the simplicity, Charles VII and his successors built the modern French state centralized, administered by royal officials rather than noble intermediaries, held together by a permanent army loyal to the crown and a taxation system that answered to Paris. The France that emerged from the 100 Years' War was recognizably the ancestor of the France that exists today. Its borders were not yet fixed. Its institutions were still rough and contested. But its spine had been put in place, in the fire of the longest war it had ever fought, by a series of kings who had learned, through catastrophic experience, that survival required organization. Breathe slowly. Let the warmth settle. The war made England too, though in a different way. England in 1337 had understood itself largely in continental terms. Its kings held French lands, spoke French at court, dreamed French dreams of chivalric glory in the vineyards and castles of Normandy and Gascony. The English identity insofar as that phrase means anything in the 14th century was entangled with France in ways that go deeper than politics. By 1453, that entanglement was severed. England held Calais, and nothing else. The kings of England would continue to style themselves kings of France on their official documents for another 3.5 centuries until 1801, an act of titular stubbornness so sustained it becomes almost comic. But the reality was that England was an island now, in a way it had not been before. Its attention was turning inward, and then outward to the sea, and eventually to the wider world beyond France and the Channel. The war had also changed English identity in a more intimate way. The language of the English court had been French, the law spoke French, the nobility wrote letters in French, the songs of courtly love were French in form and spirit. But the long war with France made Frenchness uncomfortable and English inconvenient to dismiss. By the end of the 14th century, English was the language of the court. Chaucer was writing the Canterbury Tales in a vernacular that will become the foundation of modern English, and writing them for an audience that wanted to hear its own language rather than a borrowed one. The war created, in this indirect way, an English literature. Let your thoughts drift quietly. The war changed the shape of warfare in ways that echoed for centuries. The longbow, that great democratic weapon, the tool of men who would never be invited to a king's table, had cracked open the myth of armored cavalry. It had shown, at Crécy and Poitiers and Agincourt, that a knight on horseback was not invulnerable, that the most expensively trained and equipped fighter in the world could be brought down by an arrow from a man who paid no taxes and owned no land. The social implications of this were not lost on anyone. The nobility of France spent decades after Crécy trying to find an answer to the longbow changing tactics, adding armor, adapting formation, and never entirely succeeded. And then the cannon made the whole argument obsolete. The Bureau brothers and their artillery train had solved the problem of the longbow by making it irrelevant. In the new warfare of the mid-15th century, it was not the archer who dominated, but the gunner, a different kind of technical specialist, working with weapons that required manufacture and supply chains and mathematical knowledge rather than decades of physical training. War was becoming, slowly and messily, an industrial enterprise rather than a personal one. The knight in his armor was not yet finished, but the world that had made him necessary was ending. Castillon, where the guns had destroyed the last great English army in France, was a sign of what was coming, though no one standing in that field in 1453 could have said exactly where it was going. The war left grief behind. This must be said, not the grief of courts and chronicles, which tends to be formal and ornamental, the structured mourning of people who have been trained in how love should be expressed, but the ordinary grief of the countryside, the villages that were burned and never rebuilt, the families that simply ended, the children who grew up knowing only the rhythms of war and the constant low hum of insecurity that comes from living in a place that armies pass through. Northern France had been raided repeatedly for a century. Some regions around the Somme, the roads through Normandy, the valley of the Loire had been effectively depopulated at various points. The survivors clustered in fortified towns while the land outside went to weeds and silence. The recovery took generations. Some places never fully recovered, their populations resettling into different configurations, the memory of what had been there before preserved only in the names of fields and the outlines of old foundations beneath the grass. England had its own grief, quieter and less visible in the landscape, but present, the families of the men who had marched and not come back, the coastal towns that had funded expeditions and received nothing in return, the slow dawning realization, across the second half of the 15th century, that the French territories were gone and were not coming back, and that the stories told about them, the wine country, the bright campaigns, the glory, were stories about a place that no longer belonged to the people telling them. Grief has a way of becoming politics when it has nowhere else to go. The returning soldiers, the dispossessed lords, The frustrated ambitions of an English nobility that had invested its identity in France for 100 years, all of this poured into the domestic conflicts that erupted almost immediately after Castillon. The Wars of the Roses. England turning its military energy on itself. The factions that had held together while there was France to fight discovering, in the absence of a foreign enemy, how much they disliked each other. And Joan of Arc remained. This is perhaps the strangest legacy of the war, that its most enduring figure was not a king or a general, but a girl who fought in it for less than 2 years, who held no title, who commanded no permanent force, who was dead at 19 or 20 and did not live to see the peace she had made possible. She remained in the memory of France in a way that none of the kings managed. Charles the Victorious is a name for historians. Joan is a name for everyone. She had been painted and sculpted and written about and argued over and claimed by more political movements than can easily be counted: nationalists and Catholics and feminists and royalists and Republicans, each finding in her something that speaks to what they needed her to be. She resists all of them. Really, she was too specific, too strange, too rooted in the particular landscape of a village in Lorraine, and the particular urgency of a France that needed something impossible to happen. She doesn't reduce to a symbol easily. Every time someone tries to make her simple, the trial transcripts are there her precise and living voice, refusing to be trapped, answering questions with the patience of someone who knows what she knows and will not pretend otherwise. If I am not in God's grace, may God put me there. If I am, may God keep me in it. That is not the answer of a symbol. That is the answer of a person. We have come a long way together. 116 years of history, 12 nights of story. From the sheep on the English hillsides to the guns at Castillon. From Edward III bent at the knee to a king he believed had stolen his throne, to Charles VII walking through the gates of Bordeaux with the war finally, quietly, behind him. There is nothing left to recount. Only to rest inside it for a while, and then to let it go. Imagine France in the years after 1453. Not the France of courts and chronicles, but the ordinary France of villages and river valleys, the farms and market towns, the roads that had carried armies for so long and were now carrying, once again, only merchants and pilgrims in the ordinary movement of ordinary lives. The grass was growing back. In Normandy, where the chevauchés had burned and the sieges had starved and the free companies had passed through like a slow catastrophe with no name, the fields were being plowed again. New families had moved into houses that older families had abandoned. Children were being born who would grow up without the knowledge of soldiers appearing suddenly on the road, without the habit of watching the horizon for smoke. The orchards were flowering. The apple trees of Normandy, which had been there before the war and had endured it and would outlast any memory of it, were putting out their blossoms in the spring air as they always did, as they do today, as they will go on doing when every word written about the 100 Years' War has been forgotten and the names of the kings have blurred into the general past. Breathe slowly. Let your body be heavy. Let your thoughts grow soft at the edges, the way thoughts do when sleep is close. In the valley of the Loire, the river was moving westward as it always had, wide and slow and pale in the afternoon light, past the towns that had changed hands so many times, Orleans, Blois, Tours, and were now simply themselves again, going about the business of being alive. The wines were being made. The boats were moving on the river. The bells of the churches were marking the hours in the ordinary way, without urgency, without alarm. In Gascony, in the safe west, the vines that had produced the wine England had drunk for 3 centuries were still growing in the red soil of the Bordeaux country. The English merchants who came to buy wine still came, because wine does not care about the outcomes of wars, and neither do the people who drink it. Trade continued. It always continues. The great stone warehouses along the Garonne held their barrels in the dock, and the river carried its cargo to the sea, as it had always done. In Paris, the city that had been fought over for so long, taken by the English, held for 16 years, Recovered almost without a battle, the streets were full again. The markets at Les Halles, the students in the narrow lanes around the university, the smell of bread from the baker's quarters in the early morning, rising through the cold air of a city coming back to itself. Let your breath slow a little more. The people who had lived through the war were aging now. The men who had stood in the mud at Castillon were in their 30s and 40s, some of them carrying the war in their bodies, the old wounds, the hearing loss of cannon fire, the specific quality of tiredness that comes not from a single exhaustion but from decades of it accumulated and never fully slept away. They did not talk about it much, in the way that people who have survived long and difficult things often do not talk about them. They planted their gardens. They argued with their neighbors about fences and water rights. They watched their children grow up in a world that was not at war, and found this both ordinary and extraordinary ordinary because this was simply life continuing, extraordinary because for so long life continuing had seemed like something that required constant effort and luck. They grew old. They died. Their children remembered them, and their grandchildren remembered them less, and eventually the specific texture of their lives dissolved into the general past, which is where all of us go in the end, without exception, without remainder. This is not a sad thing. It is simply the shape of time. And the land remembered nothing. This is the strangest truth about history, that the ground beneath it is entirely indifferent. The field at Crécy where the French knights fell in their hundreds in the summer grass is a quiet hillside in Picardy now, with a windmill and a view over flat country to the north. There is a small monument. Tourists come occasionally and try to imagine it, and find they cannot quite, because imagination has limits and the field simply looks like a field. The ridge at Agincourt is the same gently sloping farmland, the kind of view that on a clear day feels almost peaceful. A museum now, in a nearby building, with helmets and arrows in cases, and a film that tries to give the mud some weight. Outside the museum, the land continues being land, unbothered. In ruin, the old market square where Joan was burned is a busy intersection. There is a modern church built on part of it, dedicated to Joan, its roof shaped like the flames. There are shops and cafes on the other sides of the square. People eat lunch there. The pigeons are indifferent. On sunny days, tourists photograph the church and the market stalls and the half-timbered buildings around the square and move on to the next thing. The city has absorbed it, as cities absorb everything. It is still ruin. It is still standing. The river still runs through it, past the cathedral whose spire Monet painted 40 times in different lights, the same cathedral that was there when Joan was led through the streets. 600 years of weather. Let your thoughts drift now. You do not need to hold them. Let the Loire Valley come if it wishes, the pale river in the afternoon. Let Crécy come, the windmill on the ridge, the September light. Let Reims come the cathedral, the candles, the white banner. Let the village on the Meuse come, small and ordinary, with its church and its fields and its river, which is just a river, which has no idea what it is near. Let them come and let them go. This is what history is. In the end, not the dates and the battles and the names of kings, but the slow accumulation of ordinary moments interrupted by extraordinary ones, and then the return to ordinary moments again, and the ground continuing underneath all of it, patient and unhurried, waiting for the grass to grow back. The people we have followed through these 12 nights are long returned to that ground. Edward and his longbowmen, the blind king riding into battle with his reins tied to his knights, the Black Prince dying slowly in England, his brightness going out, John the Good, choosing captivity over dishonor, dying in London in the spring, Charles the Wise, building his kingdom in the quiet, Henry V, the hard-faced king who won everything and died at 35 before he could keep it, and Joan in her armor in the cathedral at Reims, holding her banner, 19 years old, having done the impossible thing the voices told her to do. They are all gone. They are all at rest. And you are here, in the dark, at the end of a long story, which is perhaps the best place to be. Your breath is slow. Your body is heavy in the good way, the way of approaching sleep, the way of the body knowing it can finally let go of the work of being upright and alert and present to the demands of the waking world. Let it go. The war is over. The fields are quiet. The apple trees are flowering somewhere in Normandy, and no one is watching them particularly. They are just flowering, in the way of apple trees in spring, which do not require an audience and do not keep records and do not remember anything at all. The river is moving westward. It has always been moving westward. It will go on moving westward. The dark is complete and kind. There is nothing required of you now. Not attention, not memory, not the effort of following the thread of things. The thread is laid down. The story is told. The 116 years are accounted for, and the ground has taken everyone back, and the grass has grown over, and the market squares are full of pigeons, and the cathedral windows still filter light into colors that have no names. This concludes the video. Thanks for watching. Sleep well. Good night.